a small group of clients who needed multilingual sites all kind of in a row. So we were kind of thrown into doing several of these at once. Right now, they've been French and English. We have one coming up that's going to be Spanish and English. So I will preface this by saying that we're still kind of learning as we're going, but we wanted to share some of the things we've learned along the way. So the first things we ask at the beginning of the project is, what are the goals of the site? We have some clients who their repository is meant to talk about French Canadian history, and they want to sort of make that accessible to everyone regardless of language. We have another site that's part of a school in Canada that is primarily French speaking, but also English. So they have dual French and English metadata to get all sort of matched together. And then we have another client that's coming up later on that is really focused on decolonialization in Puerto Rico. So they really, they have goals there around how things are displayed. So all of these things affect how the metadata is structured, whether they have two different records for an object, like one in French, one in English, for example, or whether everything is sort of together in one. And it affects how they want the site to look, whether they want all of the user interface to be translated and all of the object content, or whether they just want some bits of the content translated. So all these questions have been really helpful for us to talk through with the clients as we begin the project, because it'll affect how we set up the site. So Dom's going to talk a little bit about the initial site setup and what modules we have used.
All right. Pretty basic. The initial Drupal built in when you enable a multiple language, a second language, you have the three modules here: the interface translation, content translation, and configuration translation. You know, they're not too dissimilar from Drupal 7. It's pretty automated. It relies on your PO files. The ones that we've taken the next step for, which is language switcher download, which is just a little toggle to switch between the different type of languages. The big one, which is your translation management tool, is our TMGMT was the acronym for it. And the add-on we had for that was the translator Google. So this one is a service where you can send off the translations through Google's Translate API, which is nothing like the Google Translate that we all use trying to figure out some language. This is way more refined. So, and it takes into consideration context. So it's a fabulous solution if you want to look into it. We also had language neutral alias module, and I think we mentioned that a little bit later in the presentation, kind of going over that. Something that we have but we didn't fully implement. Another part of that toggle is language icons, and it's literally just a representation instead of the word English or French or whatnot. It's just a flag of sorts. Yeah. When you go to enable these modules, make sure you enable the interface translation module first. It's an order of operations for whatever reason. And it's mentioned in these links here. The PO file, you want it to have the original URL that it points to, so it can update as new updates come out, and they do pretty much come out almost daily. And the way to get there, go to your configuration regions, language, and then add new language, and you get a drop down that has pretty much all the major languages. You select it, it downloads the file locally. Once you're done, you will get this pop-up message. If you've never used Solar before, this is complete Greek. If you've used Solar before, this should be really familiar. You just get your config zip and you just need to update that onto your Solar cores and restart Solar. It's a pretty simple process for updating cores, or you can just go through the UI and import it that way. Path auto. URL aliasing can be a problem if you try to translate them, especially if you're relying on views that happens to leverage any of the URLs, which is pretty common. So what we found after some testing, the best output for us, even if the original language was French or Spanish or whatnot, just set it to English. And so I'm sure you'll be able to get this slide. So I kind of wrote these like they're instructional, so you'd be able to reference it pretty quickly. But when you're setting up your patterns for Path Auto, and I'm assuming that everyone here knows what Path Auto is, and that's probably a bad assumption. So Path Auto, instead of getting node and then node ID, you want to give it a node alias. So instead of node something, it's just simply whatever you declare your pattern to be. So we were taking the title and creating a URL from the title. And I know first thing that came to mind was we've come across some scientific titles that are insanely long, that go over the 512 character maximum limit that you can have. And so this will actually cut it off at a certain point, give it a unique ID at the end, so it avoids all kind of clashing and stuff. We found that trying to switch it to the default language, so if the default language was Spanish, it just did not behave correctly. You would get some irregularities. So English, for whatever reason, was the way to go. Also, any configurations you make, and I put it in here as a tips, whenever you're done making any changes to a language configuration that might affect, like especially title or really anything, it's a good practice just to go back into this settings page and regenerate your URLs. It's a very low cost on your system to regenerate them, and it's been a headache more than once for us. So
all right.
I'll pass it back to Dara.
All right. So after you have all that done and you have added your language, for our theme, we had to go into a few views and update them to filter by the language that you're looking at, and that you've set the site to be via the language switcher dropdown. Because otherwise you'll get things like search results that have both the French and the English version of the node showing. So we just put in some instructions here about going into views, going into the filter criteria, and then adding a filter for content language selected for page. And that will make it so that you're only viewing one or the other, depending on what you've set your site language to be. And then you want to set what entities you want to be translatable on the site. We have some people who want all of the content in an object to be translated. And then we have some people who just want 2 of the fields to be translated. So depending on what you want, you can go into configuration, regional and language, content, language, and translation. And you can just select which entities should be translatable, including taxonomies, taxonomy terms, all of the fields that are in your content types. You can just say whether you want those translated or not. And one thing we found was it was really helpful to check the box for hide non-translatable fields on translation forms. And that will make it so that when someone goes in to translate the content, they only see the fields that can be translated. They don't see fields that they can't change. And it's also better not to set the title or URL fields as translatable, because we ran into some problems around that. Although I think we did end up, for basic pages, I think we did end up being able to do that. And then the redirect and URL alias settings are really confusing in there because they say that they're not supported, but they do seem to like do bad things if you if you check the boxes for those. So we just left those as they are. There's different ways that you can translate content, and we have clients who are using both. There's automated, which Don mentioned. We're using the Google Translate module for this, which automatically pulls in, well, Drupal core pulls in the interface translations, and then we used Google Translate to get translations for everything else on one of the sites. It does require a Google Cloud account, and you have to put in credit card information, even though we haven't actually found that we've exceeded the limit of allowed translations. But you do, that's just something to be aware of. You have to like put your account information in there, and they will tell you if you've reached the limit, and they're gonna charge you. The automatically translated entities can be manually edited later to fix things that Google didn't do correctly. One nice thing about it too is that you can queue up a bunch of things to just batch translate in your cart. And I'll show you an example of that in the next slide. Manual translation is, it's better if you can do it manually and you have the time. You can't do it in a batch because we'll talk about that later in our issues section. But there isn't any cost to it, and it might be more accurate. You can also do both. So you can do some things with your service, your translation service, and some things by hand, however you'd like to do it. So if you click translate from a node or from a taxonomy term, you will see a screen like this. And if you have a translation service module set up, you'll see the box at the top, the operations. If you don't, you'll just see the table beneath that, and you can click add to add a, in this case, a French translation for this node, or you can click request translation and it'll just translate it automatically in like a fraction of a second, or you can add it to your cart and queue up a bunch of things. So this is a view of the sources screen for Google Translate, where you can also just batch select things and request a translation. And this shows jobs. You can see jobs that are in process or completed or not yet done. So we have run into several things as we're working on these sites. One of the issues we've had is around ingest. We use Workbench for ingesting metadata, which is great. But for multilingual content, there isn't a way to ingest, say, a French and an English version of an object. So what we're doing with the clients that we have now, we're ingesting everything in one language, and then they're going through and translating it in Drupal. So it's not too bad for them because they don't have a lot of content that they're trying to ingest all at once. And it's manageable, but it could be an issue for larger collections. Editing multilingual content is not very straightforward. For nodes and taxonomy terms, you can go to the content view and see all of your nodes, and you see two of each, in this case a French and an English version. And you would think if you click edit next to the French one, you get the edit form in French, but you don't. You have to actually switch your site language first and then go and edit the node if you want to edit the translated version. Field labels and views can be edited without switching the site language. You can actually just go to where the field label is and click translate, and then you can edit or add a translation like you would think that you would do. And I added a note here, there might be a way to configure taxonomy terms to work the way that you would think, where you just click the translate button, but we haven't gotten it to work that way on our sites. URL aliases, as Don mentioned, were a big headache for us at first. When we were ingesting objects that were in 2 languages, some had an English language code and some had French, it would create a French alias for the French objects, and then PathAuto got confused. So we did use the language neutral aliases module, which basically removes any language from the URL aliases, but we ran into some other problems with that, so we're not currently using that on our sites right now. Some of these issues are probably related to our decision not to add the language code to our URL as a prefix, which we couldn't do because we have some hard-coded references to certain views in the code, I think. Don, I don't know if you want to add anything about that.
I think you nailed it. It was we have views that directly like taxonomy term views. It was one of them. Main page. I mean, there's a lot of them that we're using actual hard-coded URLs. So,
yeah.
For speaking of views, for some of the views, we had some problems with the way they were translating or not translating or not even showing up as translatable different fields. And here is a couple of notes. So like for solar search content, the user interface text, like list and grid options, content didn't appear on the front page at all. We threw a couple of notes and a link in here, so when you get the slide, you're more than welcome to take a look at it. But really what it boils down to is everything gets wrapped in a trans reference and within your twig. This also is whenever you're programming and writing it in code, you're just going to wrap it in a T function, like I have referenced here in these images. This kind of fixes it. Once it's translated or wrapped in a translate function, which is kind of misleading. The word translate and translate, we're talking about language translation versus a translate function, which is not a reference to a language translation. It's just translating it into a string. But by doing that, it's now, you've sanitized the text and it will now tolerate it going through your multilingual translations. If you want a full detail on it, that link at the bottom of the description here is absolutely fabulous to get anybody up to speed on what this really means. So.
All right, so I put in some screenshots of some examples from one of our sites. And the translated text is a little tiny, but hopefully you can see. So this is the homepage side by side, the English and then the French. And this was a client who didn't want to translate the titles. So you can see the titles are in French in both places, but the other text around it does get translated. And then this is an example of a collection page. So they have the facets, the French and the English. So the facet gets translated. The title does not, but most of their metadata does not. They put both English and French in the metadata, except for the resource type and model taxonomies were the only things they wanted to translate. And so here's the object itself, the English and French. So the labels are getting translated, but the content is not. And that is it. Does anybody have any questions?